I had always dreamed of wandering through the labyrinthine streets of Morocco, of losing myself in the tangled alleys of its oldest cities. For years, I studied cultures, folklore, and architecture as part of my research in anthropology, but nothing I had read could prepare me for the visceral strangeness of Fez. From the moment I stepped through Bob Boujlout, the famous Blue Gate, I felt the air change. The streets were alive with sound vendors shouting prices, the clang of metal workers hammering copper, the bleating of goats somewhere nearby, the smell of spices and grilled meat mixed with something less pleasant stagnant water and centuries of dust. I had arranged to rent a Riad, a traditional Moroccan house with a central courtyard, tucked deep within the old Medina. The owner, an older man with wary eyes, handed me the heavy brass key and said little beyond the practical: how to find the door, how to open it, and where to leave it when I left. His tone was clipped, almost hurried, as if he wanted the interaction to end quickly. The Riad was beautiful in its own way. Intricate zelite artwork covered the courtyard walls, geometric patterns in blue, green, and white. The central fountain no longer worked, but I could still hear the faint trickle of water dripping from somewhere unseen. Light filtered down from the open roof above, illuminating dust motes that floated in the still air. But there was something else, a silence beneath the silence. Even as the sounds of the Medina carried faintly over the walls, inside felt insulated, to still, like the house was holding its breath. My first night was uneventful. I unpacked my bag, set out my notes and recording equipment, and sat at a wooden desk in the upstairs room that overlooked the courtyard. The house was large, larger than I needed, and its shadows stretched long once the daylight faded. It wasn't until the second night that I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling that came from behind the walls. But the Medina was sheltered. The wind barely reached inside these narrow passages. The sound was more deliberate, too, like whispers. I froze, listening. The words weren't in English. They weren't in French either, though I spoke enough to recognize it. The cadence was strange, rhythmic, almost like chanting. When I pressed my ear to the cool plaster wall, the whisper stopped. I laughed it off, telling myself it was the pipes, or maybe neighbors. But when I lay in bed later that night, I swore I saw a shadow flicker across the ceiling. There was no one there. The following days passed in a haze of research and wandering. I took notes on the Medina's layout, sketched the narrow streets, recorded sounds of the market. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the Riad was watching me. Every time I returned, the silence pressed heavier, as though something unseen had grown aware of my presence. One afternoon, I noticed something odd in the upstairs hallway. A section of the plaster had cracked, and through the fissure, faint lines appeared, symbols carved into the underlying stone. They looked old, withered, but purposeful. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the grooves. That night, the whispers came again, louder this time. I couldn't make out the language, but certain sounds repeated, guttural consonants that carried a weight I didn't like. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket, telling myself it was nothing more than echoes, but my heart thudded in my chest until dawn. By the fourth night, I stopped pretending. The whispers weren't random. They came at the same hour just after midnight and, always from the same wall by the cracked plaster. And then there were the shadows, not just flickers anymore, but shapes, darting at the edge of my vision. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing in the courtyard, tall and robed, but when I rushed to look, the tiles were empty, bathed only in moonlight. I started asking questions in the market, casually at first about the history of old houses in the Medina, about who might have lived in mine. The responses I got were evasive. Some shopkeepers shrugged and changed the subject. Others gave me looks I couldn't decipher, glances that seemed to say, "You shouldn't ask." One young vendor, when pressed, leaned in and whispered, "Your house. It belonged to a man of knowledge, a sorcerer. Be careful at night." He refused to say more. I laughed nervously, but inside, unease knotted my stomach. The fifth night, the whispers grew urgent. They no longer faded when I approached a wall. Instead, they rose, overlapping voices that seemed to chant from inside the stone itself. I pressed my palm against the plaster, and it was ice cold. Then clear as day I heard my own voice. It called my name, not once, not as an echo, but spoken, distinctly, as if someone behind the wall knew me. I stumbled back, my skin crawling, the breath punched from my lungs. The courtyard below was drenched in shadow, the fountain gurgling faintly, though I knew it was broken, and from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move across the tile, silent, deliberate, impossible. That was when I realized I was no longer alone in the Riad. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, that unmistakable sound of my own voice, rising from the walls, as though the stone itself had learned my name. The rational part of me clung desperately to explanations, echoes, stress, hallucination, but reason was fragile here. The Medina's maze outside mirrored the labyrinth within the Riad, and both seemed determined to swallow me whole. By day, the house looked almost ordinary again. The cracked plaster, the faded tiles, the dust gathering in forgotten corners. But once the sun dipped below the skyline, silence returned. A heavy, suffocating silence, as though the house were waiting. I decided I needed answers. The next morning, I sought out the vendor who had warned me. He saw me coming and shook his head before I even spoke. "Leave it," he said. His eyes darted nervously to the alley behind me. "Some houses in the Medina are not meant for living." "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Long ago, a man lived there, a man of knowledge, but dark knowledge. People say he spoke with jinn, made bargains with them. He died, but the house," his words trailed off. "The house remembers." He refused to say more. I spent the afternoon wandering, but my thoughts kept circling back to the Riad. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the narrow alleys. My hand trembled as I fitted the brass key into the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. I lit the lamps, but their glow barely seemed to touch the corners of the rooms. That night, the whispers came earlier. I tried to record them, setting my device against the wall. When I played it back, the static was overwhelming. Beneath it, faintly, I could hear something low voices, layered over one another. But the most chilling part was the end of the recording. A single word, spoken clearly in my own voice: "Stay." I nearly dropped the recorder. Panic clawed at me, but leaving felt impossible. I couldn't explain it, yet some part of me was bound to the Riad, to its silence, its walls, its secrets. That night, I dreamed or thought I dreamed of the courtyard. The fountain bubbled with black water, and from its surface rose a tall figure, cloaked and faceless. The whispers roared in unison, and I felt myself pulled toward it, helpless. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the call to prayer echoing faintly through the Medina. The following day, I found an old man sitting outside a tiny herbal shop. His eyes were clouded with age, but when I asked about the Riad, he studied me for a long time before answering. "The house you stay in," he said slowly, "belonged to a Taliban scholar. But his path turned dark. He summoned what should not be summoned. They say he sealed his bargains into the very walls. That is why you hear them." "Why me?" I asked. The old man shrugged. "Perhaps the jinn see you as weak, alone, far from your land. Perhaps the house chooses." I shivered. "Leave," he advised. "Leave before the walls open." I returned to the Riad with his words heavy in my mind, but leaving felt like defeat. I told myself I would face whatever was inside. I was an anthropologist, after all. I studied belief, ritual, culture. But that night, when the voices began again, I realized I had stepped beyond study into something else entirely. The plaster wall with the strange carvings, seemed to pulse in the lamplight. I pressed my ear to it, and the whispers surged no longer disjointed, but a chorus. The language was still alien, but the rhythm was unmistakably ritualistic. And then the wall cracked further. A fissure split downward, releasing a gust of air so cold it burned my skin. The lamp flickered violently. Shadows writhed across the courtyard walls, elongating, twisting. I stumbled back, my breath clouding in the air. From the crack seeped darkness, not just the absence of light, but a presence, heavy and alive. And within it, a figure began to take shape, tall, hooded, its face hidden, but its gaze unmistakable. I couldn't move. My limbs were locked, my body pinned by fear, or by something else entirely. The whisper stopped. In the silence, the figure raised a hand. And then, in a voice that was mine yet not mine, it spoke. "You are here. At last." The world tilted. My vision blurred. I felt the house close in, every wall pressing tighter, every shadow leaning closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing I remember clearly is the fountain in the courtyard, beginning to flow again, though no water source remained. Black liquid spilled over the tiles, and in its reflection, I saw not one figure, but many shapes crowding the edges of the Riad, waiting. And then darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, standing in a narrow alley of the Medina. The door to the Riad loomed behind me, shut tight. My hands shook as I reached for the key, but it was gone. The alleys around me twisted, unfamiliar. Every turn led me deeper into shadows. The calls of the market were silent. The Medina was empty. I walked and walked, but the streets only folded back upon themselves. Somewhere, faintly, I heard the whispers again, and among them, my own voice closer than ever, calling me back. I do not know how long I wandered the alleys at night. The Medina seemed endless, its walls closing in, its passages doubling back upon themselves. Every turn led to another shadowed corridor, another dead end. The stars above had vanished, swallowed by the darkness that pressed down from every side. I tried to mark my path, scraping chalk against the walls, but each time I looked back, the marks were gone, as if the Medina itself was erasing my attempts to escape. And always, the whispers. They no longer came from behind the Riad's walls. Now they floated in the air around me, slipping through cracks in wooden doors, seeping from shuttered windows, riding the wind that coiled through the alleys. Some voices hissed, some beckoned, and some laughed in tones that made my blood run cold. But the worst voice was still my own. It followed me relentlessly, echoing from the stones, calling not just my name, but fragments of my thoughts, things I had never spoken aloud, secrets only I could know. Hearing them thrown back at me in my own cadence was unbearable, like my mind had been turned inside out. I don't remember sitting down, but I found myself on the cold stone steps of an old fountain in a deserted square. The water was long gone, only a dry basin filled with dust. Yet as I leaned forward, I heard the faintest drip, 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 as though something deep below still bled into the earth. And then I saw him. The figure from the Riad stood across the square, tall and unmoving, its hood drawn low. The same impossible stillness clung to him, as though he were not bound by time in the same way I was. I wanted to run, my muscles screamed to move, but something stronger held me rooted, forcing me to watch. He raised a hand and gestured toward the alleys behind him. I knew, without knowing how, that he wanted me to follow. Every instinct screamed no, but the Medina allowed no choice. When I tried to flee in the opposite direction, the streets folded back upon themselves. The only way forward was toward him. I followed. The alleys grew narrower, the air colder. My breath came in clouds, though the night was warm. The walls were damp, as though I walked underground instead of beneath open sky. The voices grew louder, weaving together in a chorus that pressed against my skull. We stopped at a door. It looked ancient, older than the surrounding stone, carved with symbols that mirrored those I had seen in the cracked plaster of the Riad. The figure stepped aside, waiting. I don't know why I reached for the handle. Perhaps I no longer controlled my own actions. Perhaps curiosity outweighed fear. The wood was icy beneath my fingers. When I pulled, the door groaned open, releasing a gust of air that smelled of dust, incense, and rot. Inside was darkness, not the absence of light, but a living darkness, thick and shifting. I stepped across the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers stopped, silence roared in my ears, and then a single voice, deep and resonant, filled the space. The bargain is not finished. The floor gave way. I fell, tumbling into an endless void. Walls flickered past me, walls of the Riad, of the Medina, of places I didn't recognize. Faces appeared in the darkness, their mouths moving in silent screams. My own reflection swam among them, multiplying, until I could no longer tell which one was me. When I landed, it was not with a crash, but with a soft impact on tiles. I opened my eyes. I was back in the Riad's courtyard. The fountain trickled again, water black as ink. Shadows crowded the upper balconies, their forms shifting and restless. The figure stood at the center, waiting. I realized then that I had never truly left. The alleys, the square, the door illusions, all traps, or perhaps just another layer of the same prison. The Riad was the Medina, and the Medina was the Riad. There was no outside. The figure raised its head at last, and though its face was shrouded, I felt its gaze pierce straight through me. And in a voice that was both mine and not mine, it whispered, "Now you understand."